Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's time for part two of our section on Athens and Sparta. Now, last time around, we looked at the militaristic society of Sparta, and today we will be focusing on Athens. So, on to the essential questions. The main focus here when it comes to Athens is going to be on really what is kind of their most well known attribute, and that's their government system, their democracies. That's what we're going to focus mainly is on the Athenian government system. And specifically, how did they develop into a democracy? We looked at how Sparta became a militaristic society, but how did Athens become a democracy? And on top of that, what is democracy anyway? A lot of people think they know what that term is, but it might not exactly mean what you think it means. And is the United States of America even a democracy? Good question. We'll try to address that. Then for the bulk of it, we want to take a look at how does the Athenian government system really work. We're going to break down each of the different aspects of the democracy in Athens. How does this function? What does everything do? And on top of that, how does it compare to the United States? In what ways does the Athenian democracy influence the U.S. system of government? Because Athenian democracy has a huge, profound influence on really all Western styles of government. So we'll compare the Athenian democracy to the United States while we're at it. We'll even look at the ways in which they are different. With that being said, without further ado, let's begin. All right, so let's start with Athenian society. We looked at Spartan society where they were very militaristic, but unlike Sparta, Athenian society is based on art, architecture, culture, education, learning, public service. And in Sparta, public service means serving the military. In Athens, public service simply means serving the polis in any way you can. And as such, in Athens, all boys, that's right, boys, not girls, all boys received an education that started at the age of 7. And by the way, girls, you got to be educated too, but you usually got a private tutor at home. You didn't get the public education. Anyway, so boys begin their education at the age of 7. And if you think about that, in Sparta, what are they doing at the age of 7? They're beginning military training. In Athens, they're going to school. Well, this Athenian education continued until you graduated around the age of 18. Sound familiar? It should. And in school, boys learned a myriad of different subjects. They learned arithmetic, which is simple math, geometry, art, music, gymnastics. It was a really well-rounded curriculum, a lot like what you guys learn in school today. Well, they also had a little subject called rhetoric, which is the art of public speaking, which was very important because in Athens you were expected to serve in government, defend yourself in court. You needed to be a good speaker. So that would be equivalent to like a speech or debate class that you take in school today. Well, after graduation, all males were required to do 3 years of military service. Just 3. Again, you compare that to Sparta, where you devoted 53 years of your life to the military. You know, if you lived that long. But in Athens, the requirement is only at least 3. Well, how does Athens ultimately develop into the democracy by which we know it? Well, in the 600 BCs, Athens is experiencing pretty much the same economic and political issues that everybody else in Greece was going through. You had your farmers, merchants, artisans, you know, the commoners demanding economic and political reforms, a greater voice in government. The situation gets so out of hand that you have violence, you have social chaos, and it's so bad that ultimately it topples the social order, topples the power of the aristocracy. In place of the aristocracy, these people called tyrants took power over the city. Now, a tyrant, it doesn't sound very nice, but by definition, a tyrant is just someone who rules single-handedly, like a dictator. Tyrant and dictator are really the same thing, dictator being the Roman term, tyrant being the Greek term. Anyway, over the next 100 years, 4 successive tyrants will rule and make law for Athens. You'll have a guy named Draco, another one named Solon, Pisistratus, and finally the most important of the 4, a fellow by the name of Cleisthenes. And all these tyrants attempted to bring reforms to Athens in their own way, but Cleisthenes is the most important because he's really the most effective. This is the guy whose reforms will transform Athens into the democracy that we all know and love. He comes to power in 508 BC, and he expands the definition of citizenship in Athens. Remember, previously, citizenship meant you had to be a man who owned land and was born in Athens. But Cleisthenes changes that. He drops the land requirement, and now all men become citizens regardless of whether or not they own land. That expands citizenship to thousands of commoners that never had it before. And all of these citizens are all equal before the law, like in America, and have freedom of speech. like in America. And so now, with all these new people falling under the umbrella of citizenship, all men who were citizens could now participate in the Athenian government, something called the assembly. And so the reforms of Cleisthenes have brought to Athens something that we call direct democracy. Now, by definition, we all think, oh, democracy means rule by the people. Yeah, that's all fine and dandy. But what democracy really means, direct democracy really means, is a situation in which every single citizen directly takes part in the government. Every single citizen directly takes part in the running of the government, making laws, debating, voting, running the government, every single citizen. And for these reforms, Cleisthenes is historically referred to as the father of democracy. He is seen to have created democracy in Athens, which is the only true democracy to have ever existed in the history of mankind. Yes, I just said that. You heard me right. Athens is the only true democracy to have ever existed in the history of mankind. I hope that didn't blow your mind just now. So let's talk about that democracy. At this point, what we want to do is examine each of the basic components of the Athenian democracy as created by Cleisthenes. There's really four things that it breaks down to. You have the assembly. That's the main political body in Athens. You have a smaller body called the Council of 500. We'll look at that as well. If you broke the law, you had a trial by jury in Athens, just like you get in the United States. We'll take a look at the Athenian jury system. And if you were a corrupt politician, the Athenians had a way of dealing with that. It was a process called ostracism. So we'll examine each of those components. And as we mentioned earlier, because the Athenian government has such a huge impact on the U.S. and other Western government systems, we're going to analyze the relationship between the two, between the Athenian democracy and U.S. government system. So let's start with the assembly, right? But what is an assembly? An assembly is a legislature, okay? To legislate means to make or pass laws. Thus, if an assembly is a legislature, and a legislature makes or passes laws, then a legislature is the lawmaking body of a government. An assembly is the lawmaking body of a government. For example, in Missouri, we have what's called the General Assembly. And the job of the General Assembly in Missouri is to pass the laws for the state of Missouri. In the United States, our Congress, which is made up of our Senate and House of Representatives, is the legislature of our federal government. They pass the laws for the country, for the United States of America. Now, our Congress is pretty special. It's what we call a bicameral legislature. That's because it has two houses, our Senate and our House of Representatives. You don't find that in too many places. So we're a bicameral legislature, but we're a legislature. It makes laws. They pass the laws for the United States. So the assembly is the main political institution in Athens, and as a legislature, it passes laws, just like our Congress. But it also acts like a Supreme Court, something our Congress doesn't do. And it also picked 10 generals to run the Athenian army and navy, something else our Congress doesn't do. And to be picked as one of these 10 generals was a huge deal, because as one of the 10 generals for a year, you were one of the most important citizens in the entire polis. Now, every single Athenian citizen took part in the assembly. Therefore, that means that every single citizen directly took part in running the government and making the laws in Athens. This is what makes Athens a direct democracy. Now, here in the United States, as we know, our Congress is our lawmaking body. But in the United States, all citizens do not directly take part in the running of our government. Instead, what we do is we vote and we elect people to go represent us in Congress, to be our voice, to make the decisions for us. And it is those representatives in Congress who then pass the laws on our behalf. Thus, the United States is not a real democracy. Go ahead, tell your friends. America's not a democracy, because what we are is a republic. America's a republic, not a democracy. So in the Athenian government, every single citizen took part in the assembly, but that's a lot of people, and it would be impossible to get them all together every day to run the day-to-day business of Athens. So in Athens, they had a smaller body called the Council of 500. This was made up of 500 citizens who would run the everyday business of the polis. Now, in the U.S., how would we pick 500 people? We would use an election. But in Athens, they didn't believe in elections. Instead, they would use a random lottery each year to pick the members of the Council of 500. Why a random lottery? Well, in Athens, they felt like everyone was capable of serving in government. No matter who you were, what your background was, what your education level was, everybody was capable. As such, Athens didn't believe in elections because they felt that elections would be unfair. I mean, think about it. Who would win? Well, the Athenians believed that only the rich or the famous or people who were good speakers were the only ones who would win. They felt like that wasn't fair, so instead they used a random lottery. But in the U.S., as we know, we vote and elect our leaders. I mean, in America, anybody who's eligible can run for office. There's nothing stopping anyone from running, regardless of your wealth, your education, your experience. Anybody can run. And we put it in the hands of the citizens. We believe that our citizens are smart enough to pick the best people to represent and serve us. That we're able to pick the people who are best suited to lead, best represent our interests. So we're not worried about that whole elections being unfair thing. That'll make for an interesting class discussion a little bit later on. Now, let's say you broke the law in Athens. You ran afoul of the law. If you were on trial, you'd have a trial by jury to determine your guilt or your innocence. Juries in Athens were incredibly large, ranging in numbers from 201 to 1,001 people. The large numbers were used to prevent bribes and threats or prejudices from impacting a jury's decision, and this has an awful lot to do with the way juries reached their decisions. In Athens, in order for a defendant to be found guilty, all that was required was a simple majority vote. That means one more than half. So, for example, in a jury of 201 people, only 101 out of the 201 would need to believe that you were guilty for you to be convicted. This is where the large numbers come in. You see, this way, if somebody manages to bribe 1 or 2 or even 10 people, it wouldn't make a big impact on the outcome of the case because the juries are so large. Now, in the United States, those people accused of a crime also receive a trial by jury. But here in America, our juries are much smaller, usually consisting of only 12 jurors. Now, we're not worried about the small size. We believe that the laws that we have in place, our media, this is going to help prevent threats and bribes and prejudices from influencing a jury's decision. Now, unlike in Athens, where you need a simple majority verdict, in the United States, to be found guilty, the jury must make a unanimous decision. That means that to be found guilty, all 12 jurors must agree to the defendant's guilt. We believe that all people are innocent until proven guilty, and they must be found guilty beyond the shadow of a doubt. All 12 have to think you're guilty for you to be convicted. Well, with politics tends to come corruption. I don't care where you lived or when you lived. It just happens. It's the nature of the beast. And so to prevent political corruption or prevent any politician from getting too powerful, in Athens they had a process called ostracism. Basically, the way it worked was every year all citizens were allowed to write down the name of one politician that they found to be undesirable for any reason. They wrote it on this little clay tablet called an ostracon. The ostracons were then collected and counted. And if the same name showed up on 6,000 different ostraca, then that person would be exiled from the polis for 10 years. Get them out of the city and hopefully get rid of their corruptive influence. Now, in the U.S., we have a process for removing corrupt politicians from office as well. It's called impeachment. Now, to be impeached, a politician first has to commit a crime while in office. For example, let's say the president commits a crime while in office. If that is the case, the House of Representatives can vote to impeach him. That means formally charge him with the crime. If this happens, he then stands trial before the Senate. Now, if the Senate finds him guilty, he gets removed from office. No exile, just removal from office. But once you get removed from office, you are eligible to face criminal charges later on. So now here we are back to the essential questions. What did we look at here today? We examined the development of the democracy of Athens. We talked about what a democracy is and whether or not the U.S. really is a democracy. Finally, we broke down all the different aspects of the Athenian democracy. How does each one work? And how does it relate to the United States of America? So the next time that we get together, as always, be prepared to discuss each of these topics. But until then, as always, I bid you farewell.